Hello, I'm Michael Hainsworth. 1 in 3 Canadians are taking the financial advice of finfluencers as fragmented regulations and rising costs price some Canadians out of direct access to personal financial advisors. Meet Gary Edwards. He is the co-founder and principal of Golfdale Consulting. In his report for the C.D. Howe Institute, Regulatory Reset, a policy roadmap for expanding financial advice to middle and lower income Canadians, he warns of an emerging advice gap with low and middle income Canadians disproportionately affected, a trend that could have broader economic consequences.
What appears popular today isn't necessarily what's best for a long-term financial plan. I think the consequence of that is people will make poor decisions.
His report calls for a smarter regulatory framework that balances consumer protections with competitiveness. He joins us now. Gary, thank you for joining us.
Thank you very much for having me.
Gary, I suspect most Canadians don't really know the difference between a front-end loader and front-end loaded securities. So what is the state of financial literacy in this country today?
I think the reality is that it varies considerably. And it's not well taught in schools. Most of the examples, even in a mathematics course, tend to steer away from this. And so there's a very practical side of, the reality is a click of a button, you can get credit, but click of a button, can you make a good, sound financial decision in terms of an investment? And the answer is, well, it's increasingly getting easier, but it's certainly not there yet. And so financial literacy, particularly for those with modest and middle incomes, remains sort of a stretch versus something that is seeded from youth and childhood, and so our young people are deprived somewhat of hope, but also of savings and investment advice.
So they turn to wherever they can go to get that advice. And I suspect we're really not talking about the finfluencers themselves. We're talking about them as being sort of a symptom of the problem. And the problem is that you can't get a financial advisor on the phone unless you've got a minimum investable threshold. And many of us just don't meet it.
That's absolutely true. Michael, the reality is most large firms that offer very good advice set minimum thresholds of $100,000. And I mentioned young people. Of course, it's not just young people. It's many working class people. The average income in Canada being somewhere between $55,000 to $60,000. Half of our population is in that category and really doesn't qualify for any kind of sitting down for someone across the table who can at least guide them in some overall financial planning. And that reality that half of us are left out is the consequence of, unfortunately, regulations meant to protect them. Over the last 20 years, we've seen, I think it grows at 2.3 or 5% a year in the regulatory world, in the financial services world. And the result of that has been compliance costs for firms that want to serve. It's not that they have any disparaging views towards or don't want to help people who have more modest incomes, but the cost of serving them is such with all the regulatory requirements that it doesn't make any financial or economic sense for most firms to do so.
But how much of it is the regulatory component, and how much of it is the fact that if I only have $1,000 to invest, where's the incentive to provide advice to me when someone's only going to make a commission that gives them a couple of bucks? Like it's maybe a dinner out for the spouse.
Right. So what we need to do then is to support innovative business models, which already exist, that make sense and profitable in the very long run for that person to become invested. If you have a view that investments are long-term, then you need to come up with innovative business models that also say, look, we can figure out how over a longer term this person can be compensated. But you're absolutely right. If you do a commission, and why would somebody sit down for $20? Alternatively, oftentimes a regulator will say, well, people should pay for these services. And who could argue with that? Well, the reality is we've done research, Golfdale and my colleague Ed Weinstein at the Bronnesbury Group. And we ask simply, we do these financial economic models, and people aren't going to pay $500 up front. They're not going to pay $400. A small percentage will, But until you get down to, say, $100, most people who have modest incomes aren't going to put that cash out up front. Now, if you have innovative ways to build those incentives to align them with salespeople and advisors in the industry, particularly in life insurance, just simple term life insurance, but also mutual funds, then you can support getting advice to people with lesser means. And with that $1,000, hopefully one day they'll make more than $1,000. Again, Michael, it's easy for that person who only has $1,000 to spend it. Do you use it to get credit? And, just as they precipitously dig a hole, they could be over the long term building some assets that give them long-term returns. And finally, it changes the mindset of someone. Even if I have a small investment and I'm watching it grow, or having somebody hold my hand through the ups and downs of a market and saying, hold on, these are still good buys. And also there's somebody overseeing this fund, and in the long run, it's going to pay off. That makes a difference for long-term savings and for capital accumulation.
You mentioned that we need innovative business models to provide those of a lower and middle income status the financial advice they need so they're not getting it off TikTok. What are some of those innovative business models, and what can we do from a regulatory perspective to help them flourish?
One of them was simply that you had mentioned commissions, that you could give somebody a commission and you could back end load that commission, that the person is incented, the person who is giving the advice is incented to sit down and offer that advice. And with the investment that's made, they can be paid out over time. And then the firm that supports them has a number of these transactions going on from which they can pool it and give proper compensation to the advisors that they support. So much of these were banned. They were wholesale banned in the UK and Australia. And the result of that ban, and less so here in Canada, but by way of example, and to answer your question, when that happened, it essentially created advice deserts. No one was getting bad advice. No one was being held to a particular product because no one was getting advised unless you made a substantial income. So now in those jurisdictions, they're backing up and saying, well, how do we reinstate some incentives to allow for commission people to have an incentive to sit down with those with modest incomes across from the table and give them advice?
It's fascinating, the difficulty with that, and I can understand where you're coming from. A back-end loaded scenario means that the advisor isn't getting any cash in their door for themselves until that particular investment is vested. And I've personally found myself in that situation as well, where the advisor keeps calling you up, wanting to switch you from one product to another because they know that when they sell it, that's when they're going to get their commission. Let's talk about the rules that are meant to protect consumers that can end up doing more harm. This isn't a Canada-only phenomenon, of course, but let's talk about the unintended consequences, when we see certain types of reforms, because you want reform to make the entry lower for someone who needs to get that advice.
Correct. And when you're running a business, you can pool some of that, if you will, the risk of people leaving. You can also pool that and come up with financial models that allow you to compensate your reps, the people out there offering the advice, in a way that is meaningful to them, and again gets that tabletop advice that's sitting down across from someone going. The person who's in that business for the long term also realizes, and I've talked, this example holds for many in the high asset wealth management category. I've sat down across from advisors who typically have individual portfolios in the millions of dollars, and they're like, I can't advise the children of the wealthy because I'm not permitted to. Because if they only have less than $100,000 to invest, then I'm restricted from doing so. The compliance cost, their business model doesn't support it. So the idea is that, again, we want to make sure the unintended consequence of protecting people doesn't exceed the actual benefit of what is being regulated. There is another factor to it, Michael, and I want to raise this, which is there are also new rules being brought into play that have little to nothing to do with what we're describing as the problem set. That with longstanding, I would argue this, I certainly make the point in the paper that was published. If you have longstanding business practices and you have longstanding investment environments, and you fail as a regulator to determine and quantify a harm that's being caused by the idea that you have that you should regulate, then my solve would be don't do it. Stop regulating on things that you already haven't determined harm on. Now, there are things that are coming down the pipe, new innovation. And for those, you have to have sort of an understanding. Everyone would agree. You have to understand the theoretical risks. So we're in the world of Bitcoin. And so you have to come up with rules and regulations for what you anticipate to be the problem. And most would agree with that. Not always agreeing on the solution set, but agreeing that something has to be done. But for longstanding practices, I don't understand why new regulations are ever brought in without first having to demonstrate that some harm has occurred.
And you actually make a very interesting point as well that doesn't get talked about a lot, and that is that we need sunset or review mechanisms for any financial reform to confirm our hypothesis. We think there is harm. We're trying to create good. Did we create good?
Absolutely. I worked for very successful private sector businesses way outside the world of financial services, but also for financial services. And it's interesting. If you have a great new idea for a policy, something that you think will help the business, but it adds sort of a compliance requirement, just an internal one, then generally the rule is, look, if you want to put one in, you have to pull two out. Your idea has to be that good that before we ask someone to do it, we have to unburden them from doing two or three other things. I've seen that hard-coded into the business world, hard-coded into our laws, into many of our provincial laws and to our federal one, is this notion of red tape reduction, which is the similar principle. And they don't say you have to remove two, but if you're going to put one in, take one out. The interesting thing is that standard, which I believe is a reasonable one, doesn't occur within the financial services regulatory frameworks that exist in Canada. That because they operate at arm's length, they aren't required to undergo the same practice. And I believe they should be. If you have a great new idea, perhaps it is necessary, perhaps it's great. So talk to us about the rule that you're going to remove. All of these rules, each one that appears reasonable, accumulate, and it creates this thicket of regulation that is that chokes out, as our paper quite well illustrates, and others have illustrated before, chokes out advice for those who arguably need it most, those with modest and middle incomes.
So based upon everything that we've talked about here today, what would you say are the broader economic implications of continuing to allow finfluencers to guide the retirement funds of Canadians who can't afford proper advice?
I think the consequence of that is people will make poor decisions. That what appears popular today isn't necessarily what's best for a long-term financial plan.
Gary, thank you for your time and your insight.
Michael, thank you so much.
Gary Edwards is the co-founder and principal of Golfdale Consulting. Read his report, Regulatory Reset, a policy roadmap for expanding financial advice to middle and lower income Canadians at cdhow.org. I'm Michael Hainsworth. Thank you for joining us.